there children, Mrs. Ashton here. Thank you for joining me again for the next part of a series of unfortunate events, The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket. So, in the last part of the story, we left Violet, who had made her own grappling hook to try and save Sunny from the tower, but it seems that she's not the only one that's there. Let's find out what happens next. Chapter 11. How pleasant that you could join us, the hook-handed man said in a sickly sweet voice. Violet immediately tried to scurry back down the rope, but Count Olaf's assistant was too quick for her. In one movement, he hoisted her into the tower room and with a flick of his hook, sent her rescue device clanging to the ground. Now, Violet was as trapped as her sister. "I'm so glad you're here," the hook-handed man said. "I was just thinking about how much I wanted to see your pretty face. Have a seat." "What are you going to do with me?" Violet asked. "I said have a seat," the hook-handed man snarled and pushed her into a chair. Violet looked around the dim and messy room. "I'm certain that over the course of your own life, you have noticed that people's rooms reflect their personalities. In my room, for instance, I have gathered a collection of objects that are important to me, including a dusty accordion on which I can play a few sad songs, a large bundle of notes on the activities of the Baudelaire orphans, and a blurry photograph taken a very long time ago of a woman whose name is Beatrice. These are items that are very precious and dear to me. The tower room held objects that were very dear and precious to Count Olaf, and they were terrible things. There were scraps of paper on which he had written his evil ideas and an illegible scrawl lying in messy piles on top of the copy of nuptial law he had taken away from Klaus. There were a few chairs and a handful of candles which were giving off flickering shadows. Littered all over the floor were empty wine bottles and dirty dishes. But most of all were the drawings and paintings and carvings of eyes, big and small, all over the room. There were eyes painted on the ceilings and scratched into the grimy wooden floors. There were eyes scrawled along the windowsill and one big eye painted on the knob of the door that led to the stairs. It was a terrible place. The hook-handed man reached into a pocket of his greasy overcoat and pulled out a walkie-talkie. With some difficulty, he pressed a button and waited a moment. "Boss, it's me," he said. "Your blushing bride just climbed up here to try and rescue the biting brat." He paused as Count Olaf said something. "I don't know, with some sort of rope." "It was a grappling hook," Violet said, and tore off a sleeve of her nightgown to make a bandage for her shoulder. "I made it myself." "She says it was a grappling hook," the hook-handed man said to the walkie-talkie. "I don't know, boss." "Yes, boss. Yes, boss. Of course, I understand. She's yours." "Yes, boss." He pressed a button to disconnect the line and then turned to face Violet. "Count Olaf is very displeased with his bride." "I'm not his bride," Violet said bitterly. "Very soon you will be," the hook-handed man said, wagging his hook the way most people would wag a finger. "In the meantime, however, I have to go and fetch your brother. The three of you will be locked in this room until night falls. That way, Count Olaf can be sure that you will stay out of mischief." With that, the hook-handed man stomped out of the room. Violet heard the door lock behind him and then listened to his footsteps fading away down the stairs. She immediately went over to Sunny and put her hand on her little head. Afraid to untie or untape her sister for fear of incurring, a word which here means bringing about, Count Olaf's wrath, Violet stroked Sunny's hair and murmured that everything was all right. But of course, everything was not all right. Everything was all wrong. As the first light of morning trickled into the tower room, Violet reflected on all the awful things she and her siblings had experienced recently. Their parents had died suddenly and horribly. Mrs. Poe had bought them ugly clothing. They'd moved into Count Olaf's house and were treated terribly. Mr. Poe had refused to help them. They discovered a fiendish plot involving marrying Violet and stealing the Baudelaire fortune. Klaus had tried to confront Olaf with knowledge he'd learned in Justice Strauss's library and failed. Poor Sunny had been captured, and now Violet had tried to rescue Sunny and found herself captured as well. All in all, the Baudelaire orphans had encountered catastrophe after catastrophe, and Violet found their situation lamentably deplorable, a phrase which here means it was not at all enjoyable. The sound of footsteps coming up the stairs brought Violet out of her thoughts, and soon the hook-handed man opened the door and thrust a very tired, confused and scared Klaus into the room. "Here's the last orphan," the hook-handed man said. "And now I must go help Count Olaf with final preparations for tonight's performance. No monkey business, you two, or I will have to tie you up and let you dangle out of the window as well." Glaring at them, he locked the door again and tromped downstairs. Klaus blinked and looked around the filthy room. He was still in his pyjamas. "What has happened?" he asked Violet. "Why are we up here?" "I tried to rescue Sonny," Violet said, "using an invention of mine to climb up the tower." Klaus went over to the window and looked down at the ground. "It's so high up," he said. "You must have been terrified." "It was very scary," she admitted, "but not as scary as the thought of marrying Count Olaf." "I'm sorry your invention didn't work," Klaus said sadly. "The invention worked fine," Violet said, rubbing her sore shoulder. "I just got caught. And now we're doomed. The hook-handed man said he'll keep us here until tonight, and then it's the marvellous marriage." "Do you think you could invent something that would help us escape?" Klaus asked, looking round the room. "Maybe," Violet said. "And why don't you go through those books and papers? Perhaps there's some information that could be of use." For the next few hours, Violet and Klaus searched the room and their own minds for anything that might help them. Violet looked for objects with which she could invent something. Klaus read through Count Olaf's papers and books. From time to time, they would go over to Sonny and smile at her and pat her head to reassure her. Occasionally, Violet and Klaus would speak to each other, but mostly they were silent, lost in their thoughts. "If we had any kerosene," Violet said, "around noon, I could make Molotov cocktails with these bottles." "What are Molotov cocktails?" Klaus asked. "They're small bombs made inside bottles," Violet explained. "We could throw them out the window and attract the attention of a passer-by." "But we don't have any kerosene," Klaus said mournfully. They were silent for several hours. "If we were polygamists," Klaus said, "Count Olaf's marriage plan wouldn't work." "What are polygamists?" Violet asked. "Polygamists are people who marry more than one person," Klaus explained. "In this community, polygamists are breaking the law. Even if they have married in the presence of a judge with the statement of 'I do' and the signed document in their own hand. I read it here in nuptial laws." "But we're not polygamists," Violet said mournfully. They were silent for several more hours. "We could break these bottles in half," Violet said, "and use them as knives. But I'm afraid that Count Olaf's troop would overpower us." "You could say 'I don't' instead of 'I do,'" Klaus said. "But I'm afraid Count Olaf would order Sonny dropped off of the tower." "I certainly would," Count Olaf said, and the children jumped. They had been so involved in their conversation that they hadn't heard him come up the stairs and open the door. He was wearing a fancy suit and his eyebrow had been waxed so it looked as shiny as his eyes. Behind him stood the hook-handed man who smiled and waved a hook at the youngsters. "Come, orphans," Count Olaf said. "It's time for the big event. My associate here will stay behind in this room and we will keep in constant contact through our walkie-talkies. If anything goes wrong during tonight's performance, your sister will be dropped to her death. Come along now." Violet and Klaus looked at each other and then at Sonny still dangling in her cage and followed Count Olaf out the door. As Klaus walked down the tower stairs, he felt a heavy sinking in his heart as all hope left him. There truly seemed to be no way out of their predicament. Violet was feeling the same way until she reached out with her right hand to grasp the banister for balance. She looked at her right hand for a second and began to think. All the way down the stairs and out the door, and the short walk down the block to the theatre, Violet thought and thought and thought, harder than she had in her entire life. Chapter 12. As Violet and Klaus Baudelaire stood, still in their nightgown and pyjamas, backstage at Count Olaf's theatre, they were of two minds, a phrase which here means they felt two different ways at the same time. On one hand, they were of course filled with dread. From the murmur of voices they heard on the stage, the two Baudelaire orphans could tell that the performance of The Marvellous Marriage had begun, and it seemed too late to do anything to foil Count Olaf's plan. On the other hand, however, they were fascinated, as they'd never been backstage at a theatrical production, and there was so much to see. Members of Count Olaf's theatre troupe hurried this way and that, too busy to even glance at the children. 3 very short men were carrying a large flat piece of wood, painted to look like a living room. The 2 white-faced women were arranging flowers in a vase that from far away appeared to be marble, but close up looked more like cardboard. An important-looking man with warts all over his face was adjusting enormous light fixtures. As the children peeked on stage, they could see Count Olaf, in his fancy suit, declaiming some lines from the play, just as the curtain came down, controlled by a woman with very short hair who was pulling on a long rope attached to a pulley. Despite their fear, you see, the 2 older Baudelaires were very interested in what was going on, and only wished that they were not involved in any way. As the curtain fell, Count Olaf strode off stage and looked at the children. "It's the end of Act 2. Why aren't the orphans dressed in their costumes?" he hissed to the 2 white-faced women. Then, as the audience broke into applause, his angry expression turned to one of joy and he walked back on stage. Gesturing to the short-haired woman to raise the curtain, he strode to the exact centre of the stage and took elaborate bows as the curtain came up. He waved and blew kisses to the audience as the curtain came down again, and then his face once again filled with anger. "Intermission is only 10 minutes, he said, "and then the children must perform. Get them into costumes, quickly!" Without a word, the 2 white-faced women grabbed Violet and Klaus by the wrists and led them into a dressing room. The room was dusty but shiny, covered in mirrors and tiny lights so the actors could see better to put on their makeup and wigs. And there were people calling out to one another and laughing as they changed their clothes. One white-faced woman yanked Violet's arms up and pulled her nightgown off over her head and thrust a dirty, lacy white dress at her to put on. Klaus, meanwhile, had his pyjamas removed by the other white-faced woman and was hurriedly stuffed into a blue sailor suit that itched and made him look like a toddler. "Isn't this exciting?" said a voice, and the children turned to see Justice Strauss, all dressed up in her judge's robes and powdered wig. She was clutching a small book. "You children look wonderful." "So do you," Klaus said. "What's that book?" "Why, those are my lines," Justice Strauss said. "Count Olaf told me to bring a law book and read the real wedding ceremony in order to make the play as realistic as possible. All you have to say, Violet, is 'I do.' But I have to make quite a speech. This is going to be such fun." "You know what would be fun," Violet said carefully, "is if you change your lines around. Just a little." Klaus's face lit up. "Yes, Justice Strauss, be creative. There's no reason to stick to the legal ceremony. It's not as if it's a real wedding." Justice Strauss frowned. "I don't know about that, children," she said. "I think it would be best to follow Count Olaf's instructions. After all, he is in charge." "Justice Strauss," a voice called. "Justice Strauss, please report to the makeup artist." "Oh my word, I get to wear makeup." Justice Strauss had on a dreamy expression as if she were about to be crowned queen instead of just having some powders and creams smeared on her face. "Children, I must go. See you on stage, my dears." Justice Strauss ran off, leaving the children to finish changing into their costumes. One of the white-faced women put a flowered headdress on Violet, who realised in horror that the dress she had changed into was a bridal gown. The other woman put on a sailor cap on Klaus, who gazed in one of the mirrors, astonished at how ugly he looked. His eyes met those of Violet, who was looking in the mirror as well. "What can we do?" Klaus said quietly. "Pretend to be sick? Maybe they call off the performance." "Count Olaf would know what we were up to," Violet replied glumly. "Act 3 of The Marvellous Marriage by Al Funkhoot is about to begin," a man with a clipboard shouted. "Everyone, please get in your places for Act 3. The actors rushed out of the room and the white-faced women grabbed the children and hustled them out after them. The backstage area was in complete pandemonium. a word which here means actors and stagehands running around attending to last-minute details. The bold man with the long nose hurried by the children, then stopped himself, looked at Violet in her wedding dress and smirked. "No funny stuff," he said to them, waggling a bony finger. "Remember, when you go out there, just do exactly what you're supposed to do. Count Olaf will be holding his walkie-talkie during the entire act, and if you do even one thing wrong, he'll be giving Sonny a call up there in the tower." Yes, yes, Klaus said bitterly. He was over of being threatened in the same way over and over. "You'd better do exactly as planned," the man said again. "I'm sure they will," a voice said suddenly, and the children turned to see Mr. Poe, dressed very formally and accompanied by his wife. He smiled at the children and came over to shake their hands. "Polly and I just wanted to tell you to break a leg." "What?" Klaus said, alarmed. "That's a theatre term," Mr. Poe explained, meaning good luck on tonight's performance. "I'm glad that you children have adjusted to life with your new father and are participating in family activities." "Mr. Poe," Klaus said quickly, "Violet and I have to tell you something. It's very important." "What is it?" Mr. Poe said. "Yes," said Count Olaf. "What is it you have to tell Mr. Poe, children?" Count Olaf had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and his shiny eyes glared at the children meaningfully. In one hand, Violet and Klaus could see, he held a walkie-talkie. "Just that we appreciate what you've done for us, Mr. Poe," Klaus said weakly. "That's all we wanted to say." Of course, Mr. Poe said, patting him on the back. "Well, Polly and I had better take our seats. Break a leg, Baudelaires." "I wish we could break a leg," Klaus whispered to Violet, and Mr. Poe left. "You will, soon enough," Count Olaf said, pushing the two children toward the stage. Other actors were milling about, finding their places for Act 3, and Justice Strauss was off in a corner, practicing her lines from her law book. Klaus took a look around the stage, wondering if anyone there could help. The bold man with the long nose took Klaus's hand and led him to one side. "You and I will stand here for the duration of the act. That means the whole thing." "I know what the word duration means," Klaus said. "No nonsense," the bold man said. Klaus watched his sister in her wedding gown take her place next to Count Olaf as the curtain rose. Klaus heard applause from the audience as Act 3 of The Marvellous Marriage began. It will be no interest to you if I describe the action of this insipid, the word insipid here means dull and foolish, play by Al Funkoot, because it was a dreadful play and of no real importance to our story. Various actors and actresses performed very dull dialogue and moved around the set, as Klaus tried to make eye contact with them and see if they would help. He soon realised that this play must have been chosen merely as an excuse for Olaf's evil plan and not for its entertainment value, as he sensed the audience losing interest and moving around in their seats. Klaus turned his attention to the audience to see whether any of them would notice that something was afoot, but the way the wart-faced man had arranged the lights prevented Klaus from seeing the faces in the auditorium, and he could only make out the dim outlines of the people in the audience. Count Olaf had a great number of very long speeches, which he performed with elaborate gestures and facial expressions. No one seemed to notice that he held a walkie-talkie the entire time. Finally, Justice Strauss began speaking, and Klaus saw that she was reading directly from the legal book. Her eyes were sparkling and her face flushed as she performed on stage for the first time, too stage-struck to realise she was part of Olaf's plan. She spoke on and on about Olaf and Violet caring for each other in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, and all of those things that are said to many people who decide, for one reason or another, to get married. When she finished her speech, Justice Strauss turned to Count Olaf and asked, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Count Olaf said, smiling. Klaus saw Violet shudder. "Do you," Justice Strauss said, turning to Violet, "take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Violet said. Klaus clenched his fists. His sister had said, "I do," in the presence of a judge. Once she signed the official document, the wedding was legally valid. And now Klaus could see that Justice Strauss was taking the document from one of the other actors and holding it out to Violet to sign. "Don't move an inch," the bold man muttered to Klaus, and Klaus thought of poor Sonny dangling at the top of the tower and stood still as he watched Violet take a long quill pen from Count Olaf. Violet's eyes were wide as she looked down at the document, and her face was pale and her left hand was trembling as she signed her name. There we go. So that was the next couple of chapters of A Series of Unfortunate Events, The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.